All right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and I want to say real quick to you and your family, I'm wishing and praying you have a very, very Merry Christmas. Want to say real quick also, just as kind of a shout out and a thank you for listening to the reading of A Night Before Christmas by me and my daughter last week. We hope you guys enjoyed that. We wanted to do that for you. Also, real quick, before I get started in this week's based on true Bigfoot encounter story from the Pacific Northwest, I wanted to say I was watching a documentary last night, a new one out there on Netflix from Todd Standing. Now, I know that some people have kind of an issue with Todd and some of his findings and things like that, and I get that, and that's awesome. But here's the deal: whether it's for entertainment value, or whether it's you believe half or everything that someone is documenting out there, I thought it was totally worth the watch. I have to admit it was worth the watch. It was great. You got basically about an hour and a half of just awesome, almost 2 hours of great stuff. And while I find some of the stuff a little bit hard to swallow, I do have to admit there are some awesome, awesome things that I found in that documentary to be pretty powerful as far as evidence is concerned. So there you have it. That is how I feel. If I were you, I would check that out on Netflix. So there you go. With that, real quick, let me get a sip of the old Sasquatch coffee. Mm. Clear my throat for all you fine folks out there who hate throat clearing. And we're going to get to this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. This one, Bigfoot stalks family near Snug Harbor, or Lake Sutherland. It was the winter of 1989 when my family and I were stalked by a Bigfoot. We did not live in the Snug Harbor or Lake Sutherland area. Actually, we were visiting my grandparents for Christmas when this happened. I was 12 years old at the time, before my grandfather died, of course, and who knew what lurked out there on that side of Baldy Ridge. Yes, this was the Snug Harbor area near Sutherland Lake outside of Port Angeles, Washington, not the one further north in San Juan Island. It was a pretty scary moment or experience for us. Here's what happened. Merry Christmas, Grandpa. You were right. My grandma and grandpa had moved to and purchased a nice little home to retire to back in 1985 on the edge of Lake Sutherland near Snug Harbor. It was a pretty home and a great view, not to mention the fishing was awesome as the great Christmases we would spend there. Well, minus one Christmas, of course. That one Christmas not only scared me to death, it also had me nearly giving up on going out into the forests of Washington, or anywhere for that matter, ever again, and visiting my grandparents, without being forced into the matter. But eventually I got over it, sort of at least. My grandfather knew that Bigfoot roamed the area, at least along the ridges of the mountains that surrounded the lake. He personally believed they were there in the winter only. No reason why he thought that, but it is what he believed. There were a couple incidents he told my dad about. One, when he had seen two of them crossing the road one evening, and when he was coming up it towards the house. The other was closer to the house. He watched as one massive one walked past the house on the lakeside one night. I guess I can get a little bit more descriptive about them. Besides, it lays a better description to my own visual encounter. My grandpa had run down to the general store for some cigarettes and beer early one evening. He was heading back just as it was getting dark when he watched as a large bipedal ape looking like creature crossed the road, came from the lake, and headed up to the ridge opposite. He said it was at least 8 to 9 feet tall, broad-shouldered, dark in color, but could not make out the exact color as it was still slightly dark outside. But he did say it took about 2 to 2.5 to 3 strides at best before it cleared the road and was gone into the woods. After that, he kept a pretty good vigil up about watching for more sign and whatnot. He did have a popular research group come out and do some poking around, he said. Then they turned out some decent evidence he had mentioned. A few weeks after they had left, he caught a better visual of one right off the backyard as it walked along the shore of the lake. It was practically frozen outside at that time of the year, so footprints were difficult to take a picture of. But he did measure the impressions, and they were nearly 18 inches long. I do not remember the width he'd mentioned. The Bigfoot, he believed, was the same one he'd seen before. He said it was about the same height. The color was dark brown, he could tell at that time, but it looked to be the same one. He also believed it was the same one that stalked me and my family not a month later, after that visual he had when we were visiting for Christmas and getting a Christmas tree. Oh, and it was not alone. It's illegal, I am sure. So we were there for a whole week. Me, my dad, my mom, my two sisters, and of course my grandparents for the week of Christmas. Instead of getting a tree for our house, we waited that year and planned on getting one while at the grandparents' house. Yes, it was illegal, I was sure, even back then, to just go out and cut down a tree in the woods without a permit, but we did it anyways. We got there in the morning that first day. This way we could actually get some rest and head out early the next morning and get the tree, trim it, and enjoy the rest of the week having some Christmas fun. It had snowed that week of Christmas, and it was deep enough to enjoy some sledding and other fun in the snow. But first we needed the tree. That first night we had a fire pit going on with hot chocolate, and snow fell again here and there, making it a pretty cool evening, even for a 12-year-old who was usually too cool for anything at the time. My grandfather, at that point, began telling my dad and me about what he had seen recently. Of course, my dad was unsure of what he was hearing, but me, well, I was completely fascinated by it all. I will admit, as well, that I was a little freaked out knowing that a month ago, in the early evening like it was when he saw this thing, that a monster strolled through my grandfather's backyard. It was a good evening, I remember, though, full of stories, great food, and my little sisters annoying me as usual. My grandpa was a little over the top, my dad thought, when it came to warning us about venturing out too far for a tree up the mountainside. My mother, and to my own amazement, was rather indifferent to what he was saying as well. But that would all change in less than 10 or 11 hours from that moment. The sweet smell of pine. Pacific silver fir. Trees smell great. Even today I prefer that tree to any other when it comes to a Christmas tree. We were on the hunt for one that morning when we were stalked. My mother woke me up around 5 a.m. that morning. Sounds early, but she was as much as a Christmas fan as I was and am today. So getting started earlier would mean more time to have fun that day. My sisters were younger, and my mom wanted them to stay with Grandma, as the hiking, she believed, might be too much for them and their little legs. And boy, was that a good call, or a miracle. I'm not sure what might have happened if they'd been there in that situation. We ate some waffles, I remember, grabbed some coffee, which I was allowed to drink, and got the warmest clothes on we could. It snows there, a bit more than people think. That morning, we noticed the snow had dumped another few inches over the first few inches from the day before. As we left, the sun was starting to show some light, enough to see deer track all around the front yard of the house. My mom and dad led the way across the road and up the ridge before us. It was pretty steep for the most part of the hike. Not at first. The first 200 to 300 yards was somewhat hilly, flat, but after that, it was a good call not bringing my sisters that morning, as it was pretty steep and slippery terrain with all the snow. We had started climbing when I heard some movement to my left. It didn't take long. Basically east of me as we were moving up the south part of the ridge. I figured deer, but bear, and especially cougar, were not out of the question for this area. My gramps had seen it all since they moved there, even Bigfoot, supposedly. Bigfoot did not cross my mind at first, just deer, cougar for the most part. As we climbed about another 100 feet, maybe a little less, I heard the movement again to my left. This time, however, I stopped for a second and looked in the direction from which it came. It was still dark past a certain point off the trail we were on, but there was enough light to get a look at a face that haunts me to this day. I could not believe it. I looked through the trees, and about 7 to 8 feet off the ground, I swear, between two thick and shrubby pine trees, a face was there, as still as a painting in a museum, just staring at me. It was rather ugly, even more scary than ugly, truth be told. I could tell it was long, and the brow line popped out of the lower part of the forehead, at least 2 to 3 inches, it seemed. So much so I could not get a visual on the eyes themselves. They must be beady and small, I supposed, at the time. The face was kind of drooped down, and the mouth was open a bit, and I could make out a white color of teeth, but that was about it, other than it was wide across the shoulders as well. The skin was not white, grayer, I think, and wrinkly for sure. Cannot completely tell, but seemed to give a look of irritation. I pointed over, and my mom stopped quickly, asked me what was wrong. I looked up at her and it said, "Bigfoot." We both looked back, nothing. No face, no nothing, it was gone. She looked at me and kind of gave me a half-hearted laugh, as if I was trying to freak her out. I told her I was serious, and after a moment or two, my dad stepped into the conversation and blew it off as a possible bear, just trees and limbs that looked like something in partial darkness and shadows of the forest. We moved on, even though I felt like heading back to the house. The Snug Harbor Bigfoot. I know that there are people today that have mentioned the whole Bigfoot of Snug Harbor between themselves, but that is about as far as it goes. They keep it to themselves for the most part. Even I did for a long time. We kept walking, I remember, higher and higher up. Eventually we came to a little clearing where we could see a lake below and even the lights to my grandfather's house. I heard movement again and from the same direction. I was not alone this time, however. My dad suddenly asked us to hush for a second as he listened to whatever it was moving along the forest floor, just out of sight. It sounded like someone walking through the forest parallel to us. My dad made a quick call out, not a scream or anything, but simply called out a quick, "Hello!" Nobody answered, as in a person, but we did get a response. Not 2 seconds after my dad blurted out a hello, we heard back a hoot or a whoop-like sound. Whoop. That was also followed by a short whistle, about 10 or seconds so after that. It was weird. Even my dad had an expression on his face that seemed to question what he was hearing. Next thing you know, the footsteps started up again, only this time they were heading towards us. My dad pulled me over to him immediately, and my mother stood her ground next to him. We watched as a large Bigfoot walked into view in the middle of a clump of trees and brush. Its legs, of course, up to its thighs, were covered by the tall brush there, but the rest of this monster was clearly visible. Problem was, my dad was only armed with a handsaw. It stood there, and it was close enough that we could hear it breathing. Its chest and shoulders were massive, and I mean huge. This thing looked as though it could pick us up all at once and squeeze us to death in its huge arms. It was solid black in color, and its face was also dark, hair-covered, most of it, except between the nose and the top of the brow or lower forehead area. It was full of hair everywhere else, and yes, you could see it was a male. I know it sounds funny, but it being a male made us even more frightened than we were. After about a couple seconds or so, it reached up with one arm that looked about as long as its body and put it against a tree. The hand itself was almost as wide as the trunk. My mom and my dad did not move, but I felt my father's hand grip even tighter around my arm he was holding. It tilted its head and stared right at us, and it seemed to be looking more or less at my dad. Its eyes were not as small as in some of the reports I've heard over the years. Actually, they were rather large and round, now that we could see better. They looked like eyeballs, regular old eyeballs. But the brown line That was very monkey-like, I suppose. It grunted once, and that made my mother shiver and squeal. Seriously, she let out a sharp, short squeal. It lowered its arm and took a step back from the tree. My dad whispered to us to slowly, and very slowly, start moving back as well. And we did. We also began a slow but scary walk back to the house, and all the way, the Bigfoot shouted us, growling, whistling, and even barking, as strange as it may sound, at us all the way back. Ruff, ruff, ruff. It would make the sound several or more times, and each time it became a higher-pitched, almost bark or yelp towards the end. It was scary, frightening, and downright crazy. Over the road and through the woods, too. We headed back down the trail, and ever so slowly, like I said. And like I said, all the way back, we were shouted by a large, two-legged creature my mom and dad were finally calling a Bigfoot. My dad kept a very watchful eye on the thing. Well, whenever he could. Between walking down a trail and looking around just in case there was more than just this one out there, he kept a pretty good eye on the thing. Here and there we could see it shake a tree or hear the sound of breaking branches that would echo about. Plus the barking sound kept up the whole way back. We were nearing the main road when my dad came to a stop all of a sudden. It stood there, looking right at us, as it stood in the middle of the trail. It was now between us and the road we needed to cross to get home, safe and sound. It was so close I could see its breath in the air. This thing in full view now was huge, and its eyes seemed to now be looking right through us. Personally, I thought it was looking directly at me and my mom. Now, its arms were long, muscular, and the shoulders seemed as long as my sisters were tall. After a couple seconds, it looked at my dad, who seemed to be extremely resolute about this situation at the moment. It huffed, barked once, making that crazy sound again, and walked off into the trees. It was a blur after that. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen up until then and now. After a few more seconds of crashing, the crackling of trees and limbs breaking, everything went silent, dead silent. My mother was in panic mode, and it took all day and night to calm her down and get her back to normal. My father, on the other hand, well, he apologized to my grandpa for doubting him and began asking 1,000,001 questions about what he'd seen and what else he'd experienced around the area for the rest of the trip. Personally, I did not want to hear any more about it. I have to say I had a few nightmares that week and for a few months afterward, and so did my mom. My grandmother has since passed on, and my grandfather has since passed on, and my grandmother sold the house a few years back. But she had mentioned more sightings over the years, and once, one had come right up to the back porch. It was early evening, late afternoon, basically. Around dusk, she said. She went to let the dog out. She had left she went to let the only dog she had left, the other two had passed away, out to do his duty. That thing would not go out that back door. Even when she tried to scoot it out with her foot on his butt, it practically turned and bit her, she said. She looked out the door, and there stood a Bigfoot. She swore it was the same one we'd seen, only older, and now had some gray in its hair around the chest area. She could not be sure, but she had a feeling it was because of the size, the color, and the eyes my father and my grandfather told her about. Funny thing, though, when she shut the door and looked right at it, it looked back at her with eyes that seemed to recognize her, and not in some basic, instinctual way either. She thought, for a moment at least, she said, that it looked at her as though they were, well, acquainted somehow, or in some way. Weird, I know, but that is what she said. We had visited there during the holidays for years after that Christmas, and every year, of course, my dad would go out looking for tracks or sign, and my mom would stay in the house. Anyways, that is what happened. I'm afraid of these things. I do not care what my grandmother said she felt. This thing was massive and moved faster than anything I'd seen in my life. And just knowing that they're out there in the woods makes me very uneasy every time I have to venture out into them today. Thanks, Rory.